I want to be honest with you before I start. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not one of those people who gets mentioned in textbooks or has a statue somewhere with their name carved into marble. I'm a maintenance technician from Coventry. I fix atmospheric regulators for a living. I've got grease under my fingernails that never fully washes out, a second-hand apartment near the transit hub, and a habit of eating instant noodles at 11 at night when I can't sleep. That's who I was when all of this happened. I want to say that up front because I've heard the versions that have been going around. I've seen the dramatized feeds. I've read the headlines. And the person they're describing, this calm, strategic, decisive individual who somehow stood between humanity and extinction, that person is not me. Or maybe it is me now, but it wasn't me then. Then I was just a guy who couldn't sleep. Let me go back to the beginning. Not the real beginning, nobody knows that, but my beginning, the night it started for me personally. It was March, late winter in the Northern Territories. The city of Velith Prime, that's what they call it now, after the renaming, but back then we just called it New Bonn, was doing that thing it always does in March where it can't decide if it wants to snow or rain, so it does both. Sleet, coming down sideways. The kind of weather that gets inside your collar and stays there. I was working a night shift at Orbital Platform 7, which sat about a kilometer above the city on one of those old gravity pillar rigs from the 2340s. The platforms were aging. Everything up there rattled. The atmospheric processors were running hot because the heating systems were fighting the sleet interference, and I'd been called in at midnight to recalibrate 3 of the moisture extraction units on the eastern face of the platform. Standard job, boring job, the kind of job you do in your sleep. I was on my 3rd unit, hands inside the casing, rerouting a secondary condensation feed when I heard the sound. Now look, Orbital Platform 7 is loud, it's always loud. Turbines, wind. The low harmonic hum of the gravity pillars doing their thing. There's always noise up there. But this sound, this was different. It sat underneath all the other noise. Not louder, just different in a way I can't fully explain even now, years later, with the vocabulary I've since picked up. The closest I can describe it is, it was the sound of something very large holding its breath. I stopped what I was doing. I pulled my hands out of the unit casing. I looked around. The platform was empty, just me, the machinery, the sleet, and the lights from New Bonn bleeding up through the cloud cover below. Standard night, nothing visually wrong. But that sound, it lasted maybe 4 seconds, then it was gone. I stood there another minute listening, nothing. So I told myself, it was the wind doing something weird with the pressure vents, finished the 3rd unit, packed my kit, and went to the service elevator to head back down. The elevator doors opened. She was standing inside. I don't know exactly how to describe her without it sounding like I'm being dramatic for the recording, but I'll try. She was tall. Not impossible tall, but the kind of tall where you notice it immediately, maybe 6 feet, maybe a little more. She was wearing a long coat, dark gray, the collar turned up against the sleet. Dark hair. Very pale skin, and I mean genuinely pale, not the kind that comes from living indoors, but the kind that looks like the blood has been redistributed somewhere else. Her eyes, and I know this sounds like every second-rate thriller ever written, her eyes were the color of old amber. Not yellow, not brown, amber. The kind you find in museum cases with prehistoric insects suspended inside. She was looking at me when the doors opened. Not the way you look at someone you've just noticed, the way you look at someone you've been watching arrive. I said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know anyone else was up here." She didn't answer immediately. She just stepped to one side of the elevator to give me room to enter. I hesitated about half a second and then stepped in because what else do? You get in the elevator. That's what you do. The doors closed. We went down in silence. And then, about halfway through the descent, maybe 30 seconds in, she moved. Not dramatically. She just shifted slightly, so she was half a step closer to me than she'd been. And she turned her head. And in a voice that was quiet enough that I wasn't completely sure I'd heard it correctly over the turbine noise, she said, "You're ready." That was it, just those two words, "You're ready." I looked at her, I said, "Sorry." She looked back up at the floor indicator. "Floor 7, floor 6. "You're ready," she said again, same tone, same quiet, like she was confirming something she'd already known for a while. I said, "Ready for what?" She didn't answer. The elevator reached ground level. The doors opened. She walked out, turned left, and disappeared into the sleet. I stood in the elevator with my toolkit for a long moment, listening to the turbines above me, and thought, what in the world just happened? I should have gone home, I know that. I should have gone straight home, made my noodles, gone to sleep, and filed the whole thing under weird night, don't overthink it. But I didn't go home. I went to the platform monitoring office, which was staffed at night by a man named Declan Rue, big guy, always drinking tea from a thermos, always watching the security feeds with the expression of someone who has accepted that nothing interesting will ever happen in his career. I told him I'd encountered a woman in the service elevator on the upper platform. He frowned, he said, "You had clearance access tonight. There shouldn't be anyone else up there." I said, "I know." He pulled up the elevator feed. The feed showed me stepping into the elevator at 2:47 a.m. Just me. No one else. Now, I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I've had the argument with myself many times. Maybe the camera had a blind spot. Maybe the sleet interference corrupted the frame. Maybe I was more tired than I realized and I'd imagined the whole thing, conjured a person out of shadows and wind noise and 3 hours of monotonous maintenance work. Those are all reasonable explanations. I used every single one of them for the next 11 days. And then the message arrived. I was eating lunch, actual lunch, not noodles. It was a good day in the break room on Deck C of the maintenance hub. My ComTab pinged, unknown sender. The message was 3 lines. Marcus Vale. You told Declan Rue you weren't ready. We'll need you to reconsider. That was all. I read it 4 times. I hadn't told Declan Rue I wasn't ready. I hadn't said that at all. I'd told him I'd seen a woman in the elevator. He'd pulled the camera feed. I'd said, "Huh," and then I'd gone home. There had been no statement of readiness or unreadiness. That word hadn't even come up in our conversation. But she had used it, the woman in the elevator. And somehow, whoever had sent this message, they knew that. Here's where I need to start explaining some context. Because if you don't know the political landscape of 2387, none of what comes next will make sense. By March of that year, we were 14 months into what the press was calling the Galactic Observation Period. That's the sanitized name. The actual name most people who lived through it used was the Staring Contest, because that's exactly what it was. The Kethavar, and I'll use that name because it's the accepted phonetic rendering now, though when I first heard it pronounced I couldn't replicate the sound for about a week, had made contact 18 months earlier. They hadn't landed. They hadn't broadcast a signal. What they'd done was significantly more unsettling. They had simply stopped hiding. Their vessels, and I use that word loosely, because what I mean is structures the size of small continents, had been in the outer system for, by their own later admission, approximately 60 years. They'd been watching, studying, doing whatever it is a civilization 400 million years older than the first amino acid on Earth does when it encounters a new species. And then one day, without announcement or ceremony, they just became visible. Not visible like they turned on lights, visible like they stopped bending the light around themselves, like a shape stepping out of a shadow it had been standing in for decades. Earth's astronomical networks caught it simultaneously. 17 separate observatories on 4 continents, 2 orbital stations, and 1 privately funded deep space telescope all registered the same thing at the same moment. Objects in the outer system that had not been there the previous hour. The panic was, well, you remember the panic, if you're old enough. 14 months later, we were still in the staring contest. No communication, no landing, no aggression, just presence. The Kethavar were there, and they were watching, and the entire apparatus of Earth's diplomatic and military infrastructure had been running itself into exhaustion trying to figure out what they wanted and how to give it to them without starting a war. And I was fixing moisture extraction units and eating noodles at 11 at night. That's the world into which the message arrived. I did what any sensible person would do. I responded to the message. I know, but look, I've spent my whole life being the person who doesn't cause trouble, who doesn't push things, who keeps his head down and does his job. And I'm telling you, something about that message made the back of my neck prickle in a specific way that I'd only felt once before. The night the Kethavar appeared, when I stepped outside and looked up and felt in my gut that the universe had gotten very much bigger and very much closer all at once. I typed back, "Who are you and what do you want from me?" The response came in 40 seconds, which is fast for someone who claims not to be watching you. My name is Selen. We met on Platform 7. I apologize for the abruptness of that meeting. Conditions were not ideal. I would like to speak with you properly. There is a cafe on Hartman Street called the Meridian. Tonight, 8 p.m. I'll be outside. The Meridian was one of those places that's been around long enough that nobody questions why it exists. 30-odd years in the same spot, same orange sign, same wooden chairs that wobble slightly. The kind of cafe that outlasts trends because it doesn't try to be anything in particular. I got there at 7:52. I told myself I was being practical and not nervous, and that was absolutely not true. She was already outside. Same coat, same height, same pale, that is genuinely unusual coloring. She was holding a cup of something, not drinking it, just holding it. And she was looking up at the sky the way you do when you're not really looking at the sky. You're just giving your face somewhere neutral to point while you think. When I walked up, she said, without turning her head, "You came." I said, "You knew I would." She looked at me then, and almost smiled, just a slight thing at one corner of her mouth. Yes, but it's still polite to acknowledge it. We sat inside. She ordered nothing. I ordered coffee that I didn't drink, and she talked. And this is where I'm going to need you to understand something. I'm going to tell you what she told me that night, and it's going to sound insane, and I want to preface it by saying that at the time, sitting in a wobbling chair in the Meridian with sleet hitting the window, it sounded completely insane to me too. But it also, and I cannot explain this, it also felt like information I had somehow been waiting to receive. Like a key finding a lock it was made for. She said, "My people have been watching yours for a very long time." I waited. She said, "Not the Kethavar, I want to be clear about that. My people and the Kethavar are not the same. We are adjacent to them in some ways, older in others. We have our own history with them, and it is not a comfortable one." I said, "What are your people called?" She considered this. Then she said, "We don't have a collective name that translates well. The Kethavar call us the Saranva, which means, roughly, the persistent ones. We find the term approximately accurate and somewhat unflattering." "Why persistent?" I asked. "Because we don't die," she said simply. "Not easily, not from age, not from most things." Silence. She picked up the cup she'd ordered, looked at it, put it back down. "That makes us unusual," she said. "Even among galactic civilizations, biological immortality or near immortality is extremely rare. The Kethavar have it in a different form. We have it in ours. Most other species do not. Which means that most other species, when they encounter the Kethavar, are dealing with an entity that has had 400 million years of continuous accumulated experience. and they are doing so with a maximum institutional memory of perhaps a few thousand years. She looked at me directly. You understand the problem, I said. We're children walking into a room full of very old people who have already made all the decisions. She said, yes, exactly that. The Kethavar, she explained, operated on a principle of what she called threshold recognition. They did not make contact with species simply because those species existed. They made contact, or rather, they revealed themselves and waited, when they had determined that a species had reached what they considered a threshold, a point of sufficient complexity. The problem was that their definition of sufficient complexity had nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with politics or art or philosophy in any way humans would recognize. The Kethavar judged complexity by something they called resonance mapping, an evaluation of a species' capacity for a specific type of cognition, one that, as far as Selene could explain it to me with human vocabulary, related to the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without cognitive collapse, to exist in a state of knowing that two incompatible things are both real, and to continue functioning, to not retreat into certainty when certainty is unavailable. Most species fail this, she said quietly, not because they're unintelligent. Many are extraordinarily intelligent, but intelligence and the tolerance for irreducible ambiguity are not the same thing. The Kethavar's experience has been that species who cannot hold paradox tend to, when confronted with the full scope of galactic reality, choose one of three failure modes: worship, aggression, or withdrawal. They make the Kethavar into gods or enemies, or they retreat inward and never recover as a civilization. And humans, I said. She looked at me, not the half-smile this time, something quieter. Humans, she said, are the first species in 11 million years that the Kethavar genuinely cannot categorize. I sat with that for a moment. Is that good or bad? I asked. That, she said, is precisely the question. The Kethavar's observation period, the staring contest, was, she explained, not what Earth's diplomatic corps thought it was. They thought it was a waiting game, that the Kethavar were assessing our military capacity, our political stability, our technological readiness. Every assumption the Earth government had been operating under for 14 months was built around the idea that the Kethavar were measuring us on scales we understood. They weren't. They were running something she called the Sarin Protocol, a specific type of evaluation that the Saranva, her people, had developed over hundreds of millions of years of watching civilizations encounter the Kethavar and fail. A protocol designed to identify individuals within a species who displayed the kind of cognition the Kethavar were actually looking for. Not leaders, not diplomats, not scientists or soldiers. People who could hold paradox. And you think I'm one of those people, I said. She didn't hesitate. I know you are, she said. I've been watching you for 7 months. The sleet outside had turned to proper snow by then. I watched it against the window for a moment. Something about the normalcy of it, snow on a cafe window, orange sign, wobbling chair, helped me think more clearly than I would have otherwise. Why me? I said. Specifically, there are 8 billion people. There are approximately 12 of you, she said. 12. On Earth, currently living and accessible, who display the right kind of resonance. We've been working through the list. Some of the others declined the approach. Some weren't reachable in time. Some, she paused, showed the right cognition pattern but couldn't maintain it under stress. You're the 7th we've confirmed. In time for what? I said. She set down the cup again. The Kethavar's observation period ends in 19 days, she said. At that point, they will request what they call the Vethankara, the first exchange, a direct communication event with the species being evaluated. It will not be a negotiation. It will not be a diplomatic summit. It will be, the closest translation I can give you is a conversation of the kind that decides things. and the participants on the human side cannot be selected by Earth's governments. The Kethavar will choose who they speak with, based on resonance mapping. Yes. And if the people they choose can't hold paradox, then the conversation will go badly, she said, simply, quietly. And the history of badly concluded Vethankara events is not encouraging. I went home that night and didn't sleep at all. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd said. Not the galaxy-ending stakes stuff that I couldn't quite make real yet, couldn't hold in my head as an actual thing. What I kept coming back to was smaller. She said she'd been watching me for 7 months. 7 months ago, what had I been doing? I'd been fixing the condenser fault on Platform 4. I'd been arguing with my upstairs neighbor about the noise at midnight. I'd been reading a history of the Mercian kingdoms for no particular reason, because I find medieval England inexplicably comforting. I'd been eating noodles. I'd been doing nothing that should have put me on any list. And yet someone, something, had been watching me do all of that, and had seen something in it that looked like the ability to hold paradox. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning I sent her a message. I want to understand what holding paradox actually means practically. Can we meet again? Her response, yes, same place, noon. Over the next 8 days we met every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 4. She'd order the same thing she never drank. I'd have coffee I actually started drinking on day 3. She was, I need to say this carefully, not what I'd expected from the description I'd built of her in my head after that first night. I'd expected something distant, something inhuman in affect, calibrated, performative in its approximation of warmth. She was none of those things. She was, in fact, very funny, dry, precise, devastating in her timing. She'd spent, by her account, approximately 2,000 years observing human societies at various points, and her understanding of human irony was better than most humans I'd met. She'd reference things casually: a trade argument in 17th century Florence, a particular harvest festival in Tang Dynasty China, the specific way that a peace negotiation in 1884 Berlin had failed because 2 of the delegates couldn't agree on the temperature of the room. Not showing off. Just the way you mention things you were there for. It took me until day 4 to ask the obvious question, which I'll admit was overdue. Do you actually, I mean, the coat and the pail and the... She looked at me over the rim of the cup she wasn't drinking from. The word you're avoiding, she said, is vampire. Yes, I said. It's an approximation, she said. Your folklore encountered us at various points across history and built a mythology around the encounter. As mythologies go, it's not entirely inaccurate. We do have a relationship with blood, not in the dramatic way your stories prefer, but physiologically, yes. We are not harmed by sunlight. The aversion to running water is completely made up. We can enter houses without invitation. Stakes through the heart would, I imagine, kill most things. So some of it's true. The persistent part is definitely true, she said. The training, and it wasn't really training. It was more like extended conversation that gradually became more disorienting, went like this. She would present me with pairs of statements that were both true and mutually exclusive, not logical paradoxes in the puzzle sense, real-world ones, things that were actually both simultaneously real. She'd say, the Kethavar are the reason 47 civilizations in this galaxy no longer exist. The Kethavar are also the reason 93 civilizations do exist that otherwise would not have. And then she'd wait. The instinct, my instinct, every time was to reconcile, to find the through line that made both things fit a single narrative, to decide that the Kethavar were net, good or bad, to reach for resolution. She was teaching me not to do that, to hold both truths fully, to let them sit beside each other without collapsing one into a footnote of the other. It was, and I don't think I can fully convey how strange this is as a practice, exhausting in a specific way. Not emotionally exhausting exactly, more like cognitive vertigo. The feeling of standing on ground that's technically solid but won't stop shifting. Day 6, she said something that stuck. She said, the Kethavar don't want you to agree with them. They don't want you to be impressed by them or afraid of them or grateful to them. They don't want you to have a position on them at all. What they want is to know that when they tell you something true that contradicts something else true, you won't flinch. You won't reach for the reconciliation. You'll just stay, present with both things. I said, what happens if I flinch? She was quiet for a moment. Do you know what happens to a frequency when two incompatible waves meet? She said. Interference, I said. They cancel each other out. Yes, she said. The Kethavar communicate in something that functions analogously to resonance. When they meet a mind that can hold what they're saying, the resonance builds. When they meet a mind that reaches for resolution before they've finished, the signal collapses. And a collapsed signal, in a Vethankara, ends the conversation, I said. Ends more than that, she said. On day 8, I asked her something I'd been not asking for a while. You said 12 of us, I said. Do you know who the others are? I know some, she said. Not all. My people work in small groups. Different individuals have been working different parts of the list. And you've all been doing this approach, with multiple species over time. Yes. Does it work? Does the preparation actually help? She looked at me, that quiet look again. We've done this 31 times, she said. For 31 civilizations that reached a Vethankara, of those 31, 22 failed, some catastrophically, some quietly, some simply chose withdrawal and never recovered as an outward-facing civilization. 22 out of 31, I said. Yes. And the 9 that succeeded, they had your help. 8 of them did, she said. 1 succeeded on their own. We still don't fully understand how. Silence. That's not a great success rate, I said. No, she said, it's not. But you keep doing it. Yes. Why? She turned the cup in her hands, not drinking from it, just turning it. Because, she said finally, 9 is not 0. The approach. On day 11, 8 days before the observation period ended, the first of the Kethavar vessels moved. Not toward Earth, not aggressively, but from the outer system into the inner system, taking up a position roughly in the orbital path between Mars and the asteroid belt. One vessel, the smallest of the ones that had been detected, though smallest is relative when you're talking about something 300 kilometers across. The military response was immediate and, predictably, useless. Every defense system on Earth and the 3 orbital stations went to maximum alert. A delegation of 17 generals, 3 heads of state, and the United Earth Commissioner for Galactic Relations spent 48 hours in emergency session trying to determine if this was an act of aggression. It wasn't. Selene told me that the same morning, before the briefings had even concluded. It's a positioning for proximity communication, she said. The Kethavar don't communicate well across large distances with organic species. They need to be closer. How close? I said. By the time the Vethankara begins, they'll be at approximately lunar distance. From Earth? Yes. I thought about that. People are going to panic. People are already panicking, she said, not unkindly. But yes, it will get worse. She was right. The next 4 days were. I watched it from my apartment mostly, because I'd taken leave from work and nobody was questioning it given the circumstances. The next 4 days were exactly what you'd expect from 8 billion people who have just watched an object the size of a small moon park itself in their celestial neighborhood. Markets collapsed by 30% in 18 hours, then partially recovered, then collapsed again. 3 separate governments issued contradictory emergency declarations. There were protests, both kinds, the ones demanding surrender and the ones demanding retaliation, often in the same city blocks. Religious organizations of every variety had collectively decided that this was either a confirmation or a refutation of their theology, and were loudly pursuing both conclusions simultaneously. The United Earth Diplomatic Corps put out a statement saying that communications were ongoing and the situation was under control. No communications were ongoing. Selene confirmed this. The Kethavar hadn't sent a single signal. They were waiting. On day 14, she came to my apartment. Not the cafe, the apartment. She knocked at 6 a.m., which I'll admit startled me more than I'd like to admit, not because of the hour but because I'd somehow been operating under the assumption that our meetings happened in neutral territory, in that orange-signed cafe with the wobbling chairs, and that my apartment was somehow outside the scope of all of this. It wasn't, obviously. She was dressed differently, not the long coat. Something close-fitting, gray, with a texture that wasn't quite fabric in the way I understood fabric. She looked not exactly tired, because I'm not sure she got tired in the conventional sense, but like someone carrying a weight they'd been carrying for a while and had stopped being able to ignore. She said, "They've begun transmitting." I said, "To Earth systems." "No," she said. "To the 12 of you." I didn't feel it at first. She told me to sit down and be still, which felt faintly absurd given the circumstances, but I did it. I sat in my reading chair by the window, the one with the view of the transit hub, not very scenic, very Coventry, and I was still. And then I felt it. The closest I can describe it, and I've tried many times to describe it in the years since, and I'm not sure I've ever gotten it right, is that it was like standing in a very quiet room and slowly becoming aware that the quiet itself has a sound. Not a sound you hear with your ears. A sound you hear with the part of your mind that processes meaning. And the meaning, when it resolved, was not words. It wasn't images exactly. It was a presence. The Kethavar, at lunar distance, touching the minds of 12 humans with something that felt like an outstretched hand. Not reaching in, not taking, just making contact. Just saying, "Here. And are you here too?" I sat in my chair and I breathed. And I held what was happening, the fact of it, the reality of it, the completely disorienting reality of sitting in a reading chair in Coventry, while an entity 400 million years old made contact with my mind at a distance of 385,000 kilometers. I held all of that without reaching for a way to make it make sense. I just stayed. I was here. After what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, I genuinely couldn't tell. Selene, who'd been standing by the window watching me, said quietly, "Good." That was all. Just good. The Vethankara. The Vethankara began on March 22, 2387, at 3:17 in the morning, Coordinated Earth time. Not because anyone planned it for that time, because that's when the Kethavar initiated it. They don't observe human schedules, which, fair. I was asleep. Selene had gone. She didn't sleep in the same way I did, but she did something analogous somewhere, and we'd agreed that the remaining days before the event would be used for rest. She'd said, "The preparation is done. More preparation now is just anxiety dressed up as productivity." I'd agreed because she was right, and because I was exhausted in a way I hadn't been since my early 20s when I was working double shifts. I woke up because of the sound again. The same sound from Platform 7 on that first night, something very large holding its breath, except this time it wasn't a sound. It was inside my head, and it wasn't holding its breath. It was exhaling. I sat up in bed, and the Vethankara began. I'm going to try to explain what happens in a Vethankara communication event, and I'm going to warn you up front that this explanation will be inadequate. Not because I'm bad at explaining things, but because the experience is, structurally, one that language is not built for. Language is sequential. The Vethankara wasn't. What I can tell you is the content, roughly linearized into something that can be put into words. The Kethavar presented themselves first, not as images, as patterns. The shape of what they were compressed into something a human mind could receive without collapsing. What I received was something like old, vast, tired in a specific way that comes from having done something very long, watchful, not malicious, not benevolent, beyond both as categories. I held that. I didn't reach for a verdict. I didn't decide they were gods or monsters or indifferent natural forces. I just held. This is what they are, and it contains contradictions I am not required to resolve. Then they presented their history. Not all of it, I don't think I could have survived all of it. A representative portion, the shape of 400 million years of existence, the civilizations they'd encountered, the ones they'd helped and how, the ones they'd ended and why, the ones they'd simply observed and walked away from. I held all of it. Both sides of every equation, the deaths and the survivals, the interventions and the abandonments, the intention and the outcome, which were not always aligned, even for an entity 400 million years old. And then they presented Earth. This part is the hardest to talk about. What they showed me showed all 12 of us, simultaneously, each from our own angle, was Earth as they had observed it for 60 years. Not Earth's political history, not our technological development, not any of the metrics our diplomatic corps had assumed they'd be measuring. They showed us humanity's relationship with its own uncertainty. The history of every moment when a human society, facing something they didn't understand, had made a choice, stayed or fled, held or reached, endured the not knowing or retreated into false certainty. 60 years of those moments, compressed, presented as a kind of argument. The argument being, look at what you are. Not look at how good you are or look at how dangerous you are. Just look. And the question underneath it, not spoken, not transmitted, but present in the way that a question can be present when someone looks at you and waits, was, do you know what you are? I said yes. Not out loud. There was no out loud to it. I just held what I'd seen, the whole of it, the complexity of 8 billion people across 60 years of being observed by something they didn't know was watching, all the beauty and violence and pettiness and generosity and confusion and persistence of it. I held all of that simultaneously, without flinching, without reaching for a summary. And I said yes. I know what we are. We are a species that does not know what we are, and keeps going anyway. I don't know what the other 11 said. We've compared notes since in the years after, and the translations are all different, but the resonance, according to Selene, according to the Kethavar's own later accounting, was consistent. 12 humans, woken at 3:17 in the morning, holding paradox in a way that apparently only 9 other species in the known history of the galaxy had managed before them. The Vethankara lasted, by my clock, 41 minutes. When it ended, I sat in my bed in the dark and I felt, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, more like the feeling you get after you've been holding something heavy for a very long time and someone finally says you can put it down now. A specific kind of tired that's almost restful. Selene was at my door at 6 a.m. with coffee. Actual coffee, from the place on Hartman Street, in a paper cup. She handed it to me without a word, and then stood in the doorway of my apartment and looked out at the transit hub with that expression she had when she was processing something. I said, "How'd we do?" She said without turning, "You held." I said, "All 12. 11, she said. One collapsed early, but the resonance from the other 11 was sufficient. A pause, more than sufficient. What happens now? I said. She turned then, and this time the almost smile was a real one, contained but real. Now, she said, they talk to you. Not to Earth's governments, not to the diplomatic corps or the generals or the commissioner for galactic relations or the 17 heads of state who'd been in emergency session for the last 2 weeks. To us, to 11 people who'd been found by a census of resonance, prepared by immortal observers who called themselves the persistent ones, and who'd sat in the dark at 3 a.m. and held paradox without flinching. To a maintenance technician from Coventry, among others. The official account of what happened next is available in the public record. The HFY made formal contact with Earth's institutions in April of 2387. The diplomatic process that followed took 11 years and is still ongoing in some respects. Technology was exchanged. Knowledge was exchanged. 47 civilizations that humanity didn't know existed became suddenly, vertiginously real. The map of the galaxy, the map of everything, got much, much larger. I'm not going to cover all of that here. That's not what this testimony is for. What I want to end with is smaller than that. A single moment about 3 weeks after the Vethankara, when the immediate crisis had resolved enough that I went back to work, back to the maintenance hub, back to Platform 7 and the atmospheric processors and the sleet and the turbine noise. My supervisor, a woman named Petra Vance who'd worked in platform maintenance for 20 years and had the pragmatic outlook you'd expect from that, looked up when I walked in and said, "You're back." I said, "I'm back." She said, "Fix the condenser on Unit 4, it's been acting up." I said, "On it." And I picked up my toolkit and went to fix the condenser on Unit 4. I think about that a lot, the way the ordinary just resumes. The way the universe can turn inside out, the way you can stand in a coffee shop for 8 days learning to hold irreconcilable truths, the way 11 people in the dark can participate in the most significant event in human history. And then you go fix the condenser on Unit 4. Maybe that's the answer, the one the HFY were actually looking for, the one our resonance supposedly confirmed. We don't stop. We don't resolve everything into a clean conclusion and declare ourselves finished. We hold the paradox, the enormity and the ordinariness, the galaxy and the condenser, the first contact and the noodles at 11 at night, and we keep going. Not because we're brave, not because we're special. Because we don't know what else to do with ourselves, and somehow, in 400 million years of watching, nobody had ever seen quite that before. Selene, by the way, still visits. Not often. She has other work, other species to watch, other lists to work through. But every few months she'll appear, never dramatically, always with that quality of having simply stepped out of whatever background she was blending into, and we'll go to the Meridian and she'll order something she doesn't drink and I'll have coffee and we'll talk. She told me once, about 2 years after everything, that she'd been doing this work for roughly 900 years, finding the ones who could hold paradox, preparing them, watching what happened. I asked her if it got easier. Watching civilizations go through it, watching some of them fail. She turned the cup in her hands for a moment. "No," she said, "but I've learned not to reach for resolution when I think about it." I said, "That sounds familiar." "Yes," she said, and there was that almost smile and then the real one underneath it. "You're not the only ones who can learn," she said.